What you are looking at here is the second generation American Standard Jetbrook Urinal, introduced sometime around 1993 or 1994 to replace the first generation. This is probably one of the strangest redesigns I've ever seen. You go from something with a very large trapway to a very small opening, and the design itself looks a bit weird, but it's also kind of cool, not gonna lie. Let's take a look at it. Let's begin with the overall design. The outside from here looks normal until you look at it from a side, and yeah, it's drastically different. It's very weird from the bottom portion. And as you can see, the inside has also been redone too. Trapway opening is very similar to an Allbrook. The only difference is that it has a siphon jet on the inside of it, and it's a lot deeper. It's still a strange design choice, honestly. But that's what they did. You can also tell the water area is smaller. While the water usually goes from around here on the older ones, this one's just kind of refined down a little bit, which is an interesting design choice too. Although you do have the ledges still, but kind of also a little bit refined. Let's have a look at a flush. Honestly, the flush is not that bad. It's a little bit different compared to the first generation, but it still blows out and delivers on the flush, even if it didn't look like it would from first-hand appearances. I've already mentioned the design, but it still kind of boggles me how they designed this urinal. It looks so weird, but I kind of like it at the same time. I mean, this is coming from someone who does not like the second-gen Allbrook from the 1.0 gallon era that this was also made. And this is obviously based on the Allbrook of the same time this was made, but it's definitely delivered a lot better. Now let's have a look at ball rinse. This one's pretty interesting. As you can see, it doesn't really seem to have a lot of rim jets, but it kind of covers the whole area perfectly. It goes around from the sides and goes up the front. Some of it goes straight down. It's very weird. And that is the second generation American Standard Jetbrook Urinal. A very interesting redesign, but a pretty cool one at that. This at first looks like it would underdeliver compared to the first generation, even though that has its own problems, as we'll discuss later. But this is a pretty cool redesign, even if it didn't look like it at first. Now, let's grade it. I'm going to be completely honest with you, I don't really like the overall design of the second gen Jetbrook. It just looks weird, and not in a very good way. From the top perspective, it looks perfectly fine, but the bottom just looks awkward to look at. I'm not a big fan of it, and I give it a 4. The flush is actually not too bad. It actually has a pretty interesting flush, even though it may not look the most interesting out of most blowout urinals. It does work perfectly well, and actually has a pretty long flush for what it is, and I give it a 7. Of the urinals I've reviewed so far, this probably has the most perfect rim rinse I've ever seen. Like, I was kind of curious on how the rinse would be going into this, since I rarely see these. But kind of observing this one, it actually is pretty excellent. It covers the entire area perfectly well, and even covers the front, which is kind of where I figured it would have the most problems. But it actually covers the entire room perfectly. So a perfect 10 is reasonable for this score. This thing actually works pretty well. Obviously, you need a lot of pressure for this to work, and that's with most blowout urinals, but given the right circumstances, these actually do work pretty well. They blow out a lot more properly than compared to the previous generation, and they're very effective. Sure, the trapway is a lot smaller, but I mean really, you shouldn't be putting stuff inside this urinal anyway. But besides that, this thing actually is very effective and works very well. I give it an 8. For something pretty much knocking off the second gen Allbrook, I really wasn't expecting much from this urinal. But I'm kind of impressed. This sure is a lot cooler than I expected. Sure, it has a smaller trapway, and sure, the design really isn't the greatest compared to its prior generation, but in action, this actually works fairly well. It has excellent bowl runs. The flush actually isn't too bad for what it is, and it works very effectively at doing its job. Compared to its prior generation, it definitely works out a lot better, even though the prior generation looks a lot more cooler. But in terms of effectiveness and doing its job, it's definitely a lot better, with a lot less problems coming up from its design flaws. Again, I don't really like how small the trapway is for a blowout urinal, and for the fact that the design just doesn't look great, but this is still a pretty unique urinal, and I do gotta give credit where credit's due, and I give it an 8. The final score of the second generation American Standard Jetbrook urinal is a 37 out of 50, which equates to a 74 out of 100. I really wasn't expecting much other than this genre besides being a cool novelty from its time that's very rare. But I'm honestly kind of impressed. The flush is actually pretty decent for what it is. It has excellent rinse, and it works effectively well given the right circumstances compared to the first generation. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the design, but this is still a pretty interesting novelty that's very rare to come across.